As you're starting to discover, you can use and apply filters in order to come up with some really creative effects. Yet at this point, I should also point out that there are filters which help you make corrections, whether that's to reduce noise or to sharpen your image or to correct distortion. Well, we'll be covering those other filters in different chapters, yet here we're going to focus in on how we can get creative with these different filters. And in this movie, rather than using smart filters, what I want to do is simply duplicate my background layer a few times. To do that, press Command-J twice on a Mac or Control-J a few times on Windows. I'll go ahead and rename these layers. I'll name this top one B1 and then the underline one B2 for Blur 1 or Blur 2. I just want to start to showcase some of the different blur effects which we can apply. To do that, click on one of those layers and then go to your Filter pull-down menu and then select Blur. As we've seen, there's blur which allows us to kind of soften everything in the image. There also are different types of blur as well. One that I want to highlight is this one here, which is called radial. Radial allows us to create a blur which is either a spin effect, as you can see here, or a zoom effect. By doing this, we can then recenter where this area or where this blur is going to focus in on. You can also control the overall amount of the blur. In order to make it less subtle, we can decrease the amount. Well, here what I want it to do is to kind of zoom in on the picture. To apply this, just click OK. Now, when you're working with a layer, especially with a blur like this, sometimes you won't nail it. Notice that it's zooming into the sail. I want it to zoom in on the subject. Well, how can we then undo that and reapply the filter when we're going for this layered approach? Well, if you're doing that, you can undo by pressing Command-Z on a Mac or Control-Z on Windows. Then, if you go to your Filter pull-down menu, it will show you the last filter which you applied. It was radial blur. You could reopen that filter by pressing a shortcut. The shortcut is Command-Option-F on a Mac or Control-Alt-F on Windows. And by pressing that shortcut, it will reopen that dialog of the last filter that you used. In this case, I can then reposition this down here and then go ahead and click OK in order to apply that. So it's now zooming in on the subject. Let me show you, or tell you, I should say, those shortcuts again. You press Command or Control-Z, then you press Command-Option-F on a Mac or Control-Alt-F on Windows. That reopens the last blur which you've applied, again giving you a lot of flexibility when you're working with this layered approach so that you can dial in just the right amount of blur. Well, here with a picture like this, which is kind of dreamlike, this blur is kind of interesting. It adds something to the photograph and changes the overall mood and really what we're communicating with this image. Well, let's look at yet another type of blur. To do that, we'll just turn off the visibility of this layer and then target the other layer, B2, Blur 2. For this one, we're going to go to Filter and then Blur, and this time I want to navigate to Field Blur. These three blurs, field, iris, and tilt, they're fascinating. Let's start off with field. What you'll find here is that now you'll have even more precise control and you'll be able to see a big preview of your image rather than that small little dialogue that I was trying to use to figure out the zoom. Well, here I can see the whole image, and there's this heads-up display icon here which I can then move around. If I click and drag this, say, to the front of the image, I can then control the overall blur that we're seeing in the entire picture. Yet I can also add another point, say for the subject. And on this other point, you can either click and drag on this icon or on the slider, and you can see that I can remove the blur from this particular person here so that it's blurry in the front of the picture, but it's not blurry in the back of the picture. We can set multiple points by simply clicking. You can see that as I'm doing that, I'm really kind of creating this circular blur effect so that all around the subject, everything is blurred except for this particular part of the picture. Now, what's interesting about this is that this allows us to create a blur effect which we couldn't really have created on camera, or we couldn't have created any other way without a lot of steps. If we zoom in on it, you can see how the blur is right here. To reactivate one of these areas, we'll just click on it and you can move that, and you can see how it's kind of pushing off these other blur effects and creating that different shape. You can also have multiple subjects that are in focus. Here, I could go up to the top of the sail, say, and click to add a point, and then bring in some focus to this area, so that now I have the sail and also the subject in focus. In a sense, it's almost like you're able to bend focus a little bit. You can come up with, as I mentioned before, these just really imaginative or creative results. Well, what I find is in this dialogue, while it allows me all of this flexibility, the one thing I find distracting are all of these little icons. To hide those, press the H key. That allows you to view your image without any of those controls on it in order to evaluate if you've made some changes which are good. Another great way to evaluate your file is to click on the preview button. By doing so, you can see that overall before and then now after. Well, after you've dialed in what type of blur or focus you want, in order to apply this, just click OK, and it will then apply or render that effect on this other layer so that we can see that effect here. Here it is. We can click this on or off. Here's our before and after. There's one blur option, or here is another blur option. And by using multiple layers like this, well, in a sense, we still have flexibility. If ever we want to apply a blending mode to one of these layers, like we did with smart filters in the previous movie, we'll just go down and choose that blending mode. If you want to change the opacity or create a mask, again, you can do that. So you can do the same things that you do with smart filters on layers. Again, really, it's just a preference in regards to your overall workflow. All right, well, now that I've showcased these two different types of blurs, I want to dig deeper into a couple other filters. And so let's continue to talk about how we can work with filters, and let's go ahead and do that in the next few movies.